Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am your host tonight for episode 45 of Hunting the Shadows. My name is Dennis Carroll, and I want to welcome you to the show. I want to give a shout out to everybody that's really gathering in the chat room tonight. I'm going to be bringing on my very special guest shortly. And I want to say hello to everyone out there, and I appreciate your support and for you being here. And there we go. Yes, I'm going to put that up right quick. Thank you for that, Gerald. That is the Bram Stoker Estates. Speaking of that, we have Mr. Dacre Stoker with us tonight, renowned author and great grandnephew of Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. And we will bring him on shortly. He's a fascinating fellow. He's into a lot of different things. We're going to talk about that, and who knows what rabbit holes we'll go down, but we'll see. And I want to give a shout out to my good friend Barbara Hartman. Please go and check out her channel. Show her channel some love if you get a chance. And also check out my good friend Gerald. Gerald Fountain, the Midwest Night Watchers. He has a store, okay? And we will be putting that link up later, but he has a store. That's the perfect place for you to shop for my Christmas gift, okay? And there you go. And also want to give a shout out to my good friend Jessica Jones, the Cryptid Huntress. And she had a fantastic show on today. One of my favorite subjects, werewolves. And it was great. So check that out. And don't forget, she has a store too. More places to shop for my Christmas gifts. Okay. She has a store on Etsy called War Woman Goods. Check it out. She's got some really great stuff on there. Well, I appreciate. See, we're getting a very large crowd in here tonight, and that's good. And we have a lot of ground to cover tonight, so I'm going to get to it. I want to tell everyone, please kind of hold your questions for the end of the show here, okay? Because we'll spend a few minutes answering your questions at the end, and we'll get through. But kind of hold your questions if you can, for the very end, for the last maybe 15, 30 minutes, okay? And hold them back so that I can find them, okay? Because the chat is moving very fast, okay? I appreciate that. And I want to thank my moderators who are doing an excellent job tonight. Absolutely. And now I want to bring on my very special guest. Great author here, and great guy all around. I really always enjoy talking to him. Mr. Dacre Stoker, how you doing
Hey,
tonight,
Dennis.
sir?
Thank you for having me as your partner tonight, Hunting the Shadows.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I'm going solo tonight.
That's okay.
and
Just going to be you and me in the shadows.
yeah, there you go. And definitely, we are definitely going to go into some interesting realms, I hope. And that's what I was telling earlier here. Let me get my book. Everybody out there needs to get this book here. I will show you another picture of it in a little while here. But this is a great book that actually, thank you, Dacre, for autographing that for me. But it's Dracula, the annotated the 121st anniversary, and it has got some fascinating postscripts and stuff in it. You need to check that book out, definitely. It is great. I enjoyed it immensely. And that's what we're going to talk a
Well,
little
thank
bit
you,
about tonight. I wanted to get a little
Dennis. I
bit.
got to tell you something. While you held that
Yeah.
up, an interesting memory came back to me. The image on the front
Oh,
cover,
yeah.
if I may, because, not only because, but your podcast title, Hunting the Shadows. When I met
Mm-hmm.
a Damien Bulmer in Ireland at a film festival. He's an
Uh-huh.
artist. He was actually a graphic artist doing work at that time on the
Oh,
Penny Dreadful series that's now on Showtime. And I
wow.
love the series. And I didn't realize he's the guy behind the scenes doing all the graphic art. like everything you see on the scenes. And he said, I'd really love to do something for you, Dacre. Uh, and I said, well, I really need one of my own images of Bram Stoker. There's not many out there, and all of them have been recycled for 120 some odd years. So I would like to commission you. And he said, what are you thinking of? And I said, I'm thinking of Bram Stoker in the shadow. And I say, because half of his face, people know only half of Bram. And I'd like the other half to sort of look like it's blending and hiding in the shadow. So
That's
it's
really
my job
neat.
to bring him in out of the shadow, so to speak, and let people know the shadowy side of him. So that's the image you see on the book Dennis is holding. So I commissioned this guy, but 6 months later, I got the painting shipped over to me in America. I got him to sign it, and I decided this is the right book, Dracula annotated for the 125th anniversary, with my good friend, the late Robert 18 Bassang, annotated, including all these cool things that were taken out of the novel during the editing stages in the typescript. All these things crossed out, we put back in. So it's really the definitive Dracula as Bram planned it, with notes and things put back into it.
That was a splendid job, and definitely did a fantastic job on that. And it's very, very artistic looking, like you're bringing Bram out of the shadows a little bit more, for us to understand how he was thinking, the things and all that. And that's, what I was going to discuss a little bit with you tonight, some of the characters that I have grown to love in this book, because I read this book at least 3 times a year. Okay, I love it. I love the way it's genius the way it's laid out. To be a sort of like excerpts from a diary, a journal that you're reading. That kind of brings you in on it. In a very unique kind of way. But I've got to wonder, and I want to ask you this. As a writer, and you understand what I'm about to say, when we write something, and I've done this with a couple of books I've written, you put yourself into that book. That you are a large part of that book, because that's your effort, that's your talent, and that's your time and everything. And here's the interesting thing about people who write fiction. I always wonder which one of the characters is the author. Because one of them is basically always, it may be a combination of several characters, but one has always usually got more invested in the character. Who do you think in Dracula that Bram Stoker is in character-wise?
There's no question that you've hit the nail on the head. Authors do this. They take certain characteristics of yourself, certain leanings, certain philosophy that you may have, and it does come out in the way you write. You're influenced by a number of things. The character that is Bram Stoker, actually very overtly, is Jonathan Harker. Absolutely no question. He is the young solicitor. So for your listeners who don't know too much about my great granduncle, Bram himself, when she graduated from college, Trinity College, and was a real leader amongst his men, head of the Philosophical Society, the Historical Society, all the sports teams he was on. He was the captain, the leader, the committee man, founding member of the Dublin Painting and Sketching Club. He was a leader. But then he also went off to the theater, but he also, prior to that, got a job in the British government in Ireland, in Dublin Castle, it was called. He was a clerk of the Petty Sessions legal department. So he functioned as a legal clerk. And then he got promoted to be the inspector of all the clerks all over Ireland, which meant in the late 1800s, he got to travel to all 30 different counties in Ireland by train, by carriage, to go check up on and inspect all the clerks of the legal departments of Petty Sessions. Now, Petty Sessions is lower than the murders and all the exciting stuff. It's the boring stuff, but it's the clerical, detail-oriented things that make the world go round. And Bram found that everything was not operating efficiently, so he came back after many trips, told his boss. He said, well, we don't have any money to do anything about it, Stoker. Go do something yourself. So out of his own pocket, he published a book called The Duties of Clerks of Petty Sessions, a legal manual for all the clerks to follow. That manual, Dennis, was in use until 1962, and then it was upgraded. 1962. Bram wrote this in 1879. Now, if that alone doesn't give you a hint, Jonathan Harker travels from England, goes across on the ferry to Paris, takes the train, travels all over Europe on the train. He's got to go in a carriage once he gets to Bistrica, Romania, Transylvania at the time, up into the Borgo Pass, all real places, just like he's traveling as the inspector of clerks. He's going to the castle to consummate all the real estate transactions for Count Dracula, buying the properties and shipping all his boxes of dirt over to England. This was not a trip for fun. He didn't get lured in to give blood. It was a legal trip. And along the way, he's talking about himself as the young solicitor and so on. So I am sure it's that sort of approach that Bram had to life, doing the right thing, the legal type thing, but a little bit deeper, Dennis, than that. He's not trying to be the hero. He's that man behind the scenes. And people think, oh, he's a weenie. You know, he didn't stand up to Dracula. He had to stand up to Dracula. Yeah. At the very end, he's the guy with Morris jumping up and stabbing the Count, slitting his throat. But throughout the whole thing, even though he's traumatized by being a prisoner for a couple of months, and he somehow escapes, he's got, they called it, sort of brain fever back in those days, which, he had some sort of a mental lapse, some kind of a anxiety attacks or whatever it was. So he recovered, but he came back vigorously and strong. And that's like Bram recovering from his childhood illness of 7 years, coming back strong and recovering to become an athlete and the head of everything. So I'm glad you asked that, because so many people, and in certain movies, they depict Harker as being, well, he was this little solicitor out of his element.
Well, what
but
I
no,
like
he
about
pulled
that,
himself together.
he's saying, I'm not going to be the victim here,
Yes.
I'm going to take charge of this, That's what I like about it.
He did. And I'm glad you said that, because in the novel, that's Harker. But he gets depicted because certain, directors and screenwriters in movies decide to do things differently because, we need a victim. We need a, guy who's can't stand up to Dracula. That's not Stoker's novel. What you just said is. And so, well, there we go. I won't harp on it, but I'm sure there's many different elements of Bram filtered in to, well, also the, knowing the train schedules. He's also a very level-headed guy, Harker is. He's got other characters in there for different reasons. We could talk about all the cast of characters, and they've all got a place to play. But Harker, I believe, represents that if things are done properly legally, then things will prevail. You still have to have truth. You have to have faith. You have to have the goodness in people, but legally, you got to do things right. And sometimes the law, in the case of the supernatural villain, doesn't stand up. But what does stand up is your faith in others, your faith in God, the religious icons, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And he was, in many ways, he was very meticulous with how he went about this. And that shows his clerical type mind going on here. He was very meticulous in laying this out, just like you said with the trains and the train schedules and all that. That's fascinating. And then, but here's another thing I liked about it. He's very modern. They've got the wax cylinders. She's got one of the first typewriters, kind of thing. He's very modern in that respect. So he doesn't get bogged down in the mediocrity of it. You know what I'm saying? That's the neat
You're
part.
right. Bram himself, being a theater manager, now mind you, it took him 7 years to write this because he was so busy doing his theatrical work. But he also benefited, and he was open-minded about many things. Technology was one of them, Dennis. Technology that could better society, the technology that could better the theater, like lighting versus, electric lighting versus gas lighting. Bram even brought a guy in who was very smart in in electricity and figured out how to wire up two swords for a sword fighting scene in the play Faust. So think of this, guys. In the
Mm-hmm.
late 1800s, Bram invented, well, I wouldn't say Bram invented, he worked with the guy who showed it on stage the first time, the clash of lightsabers. When these swords hit on the stage at Lyceum Theater, blue sparks flashed up, smoke came up, just
Mm-hmm.
like George Lucas in
Special
Star
effects.
Wars with the lightsabers. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he was really into modern tech. So as you said, yeah, the wax cylinder that Dr. Seward would record into, a recording phonograph, the wax cylinder.
Mm-hmm.
Mina Harker typing on a portable typewriter, no less, to take the notes. Things like the searchlight in Whitby that was used for the ship coming in, brand new at the time. Edison had just invented that big searchlight. That was a mobile thing to help the ships come into the harbor in storms.
Yeah.
Telegrams, all that's new. And I believe it's a statement, Dennis, that Bram's making, saying, listen, these are new things, kind of like we are, Dennis, with fusion and fission and atomic energy. These are new. They've got to
Mm-hmm.
be harnessed properly, and they can be used to great effect. Wind energy and solar energy got to be used to great effect. There are some negative side effects, but if we use it right, it can help us. What's he using it right against? The supernatural, the dark side, the things that people don't quite understand about the vampire. And this is why Van Helsing was the character that brought that out of the shadows and into the light of the band of heroes. And so what they've got is, because the supernatural can have thought control over people they share blood with, they can fly like the bat, they can move into different shapes like rats and wolves and mist. So they've got their bag of tricks. Bram Stoker and Van Helsing and the boys and Mina have modern forms of communication, modern forms of technology. When Dracula comes in and gets into Seward's office and he destroys the wax cylinder, but he had copies made. Seward did. So modern tech
Mm-hmm.
played a pretty high role in this epistolary story.
Very cutting edge, and you can see the theatrical aspect of this, and like, and here's the thing, it really bugs me, Dacre, about some people when it comes to Bram Stoker. They look upon him as sort of an amateur that just throw this out, just happened to do this. They write him off in that respect, which I think is very unfair, because, like you say, he was very big in the theatrical world. He was very deep into that. He had many different aspects, being clerical in that respect and all that, and then remembering the stories that his mother and grandmother probably told him. A lot of this stuff, and I've actually found several instances of Irish. I'm very interested in folklore, so I have found several very interesting instances of Irish vampires. Okay, so I think that could have had some of these stories could have had some of that effect upon him. I think they did. But why do I don't know? People want to write him off as being like an amateur that just happened to do this, and that was all he ever had in him. But I think the man was much deeper than that. Uh,
I
Yeah.
couldn't agree more. I do see that, when these sort of highfalutin scholars kind of say, well, he was a hack writer and he managed to knock out one really big, great story.
Mm.
Okay, so his writing style may not have been super smooth, like some of the others. But as you say, he put together Dracula in the epistolary style that
We all
really
can't be
made,
Shakespeare.
well, heck no. But it makes, even to this day, it's a book that makes the readers think, and it makes you really think about every
Mhm.
different perspective of every different person in the story, who is writing a letter and says something, who is looking at a newspaper article, who's writing a journal. And so you've got to think, what does that person understand? Where are they coming from? So it's a style that he used for this book. He didn't use it for others. Now, mind you, I think the second best story that he wrote is Mystery of the Sea. There is a little bit of that, not a lot. He wrote it a few years later, but it is a story with a ghost element to it, a supernatural element. But it's all based in Scotland, and it's got to do with Spanish Armada, Spanish gold, which has a big impact when remember the Spanish Armada
Kind of
was
adventure
blown
like.
by a hurricane all the way up into Scotland. So
It's kind of an
some
adventure story as well. I mean,
absolutely, yeah, it is, and it's also set in a real place, as is Dracula. So he creates this feeling of a supernatural thriller adventure story, but rooted in real places with real people, real train schedules, real letters, the times that the letters would go from A to B, the time they would take the carriage to go from B to C, the time for it takes a box of dirt or 50 of them to travel by train and then move into different addresses, all accurate, which makes people believe, heck, maybe this stuff is real. And he does it in not a flowery way, but a very sort of common type way.
That's very interesting. And I want to ask you this question, okay? Do you think that he may have been inspired a little bit by Frankenstein, by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley? The way it was written was like in a journal type thing. Do you think he may have been inspired by that? And might have got the idea for something like that?
Oh, I think so. Listen, I can't state how important that Frankenstein was, written like 70 years earlier. But first of all, Bram was, I say, a bit of a feminist. It was not usual to be somebody who we call now a feminist back in those days. But he was. He had great respect for his mother, who was a real activist, his two sisters. Oscar Wilde's mother he was very close with Lady Jane Wilde. She was a real mentor to him. And I think Bram, although he never met Mary Shelley, had great respect for her writing and got dialed into it. I recently wrote a foreword to a book that is all about sort of stories by contemporary authors that were inspired by Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley. And I had to look at, which was interesting for the intro, all the similarities, Dennis. And there are quite a few similarities. And one of them is, both of the heroes, so to speak, either, protagonist and antagonist, but the antagonist, Frankenstein and Dracula, are like come from the dead, right? One cobbled together, one sort of more cobbled together by myth.
Between two worlds. Yeah.
Yes. And there's a lot of traveling from places on ships in both places, which leads to the imagination. And of course, Frankenstein, sort of the whole idea, somewhat stimulated by Mary Shelley's trip up the Rhine and to Castle Frankenstein. And of course, even though Bram Stoker never went all the way to Romania, everything is about a trip far off distant lands. Things happen over there in the first 3 chapters with Jonathan Harker. So there are those similarities. And one other interesting piece that I've got 2 sources that I refer to in a lot, Dennis. One is Bram's Lost Journal. And it's a journal that I discovered in the Isle of Wight. His great-grandson, one of my cousins, had Bram's journal there. And one of the entries went something like this. And it was an entry where it was obvious Bram was just writing down notes of things to think about or to remember for a story. So he wasn't writing, got to do a podcast tonight, Hunting the Shadows with Dennis Carroll. It was more of interesting thought. Man brought back to life by new power. And I think that's it. Man brought back to life by application of new power. So that was just one thought.
Well, back then, electricity had a very mystical look to those people. They didn't really understand its properties. They thought it was more like magic in many ways. And I think that shows up in Frankenstein a lot. That's another one of my favorite novels. I read it a lot. And it shows up in that. But a lot of the creation of the monster was chemical too. You know, it
Yeah.
wasn't just simply
Go ahead.
electrical. But here's the interesting thing: the correlation between those two things. And I know that Bram had a falling out with Oscar Wilde. You know, after he got arrested, they weren't on good terms that much anymore. I think they kind of smoothed that over eventually, but anyway, they weren't on good terms. But what I find very fascinating about Bram is he was so interested in the American writers, like Walt Whitman and Poe and some of these others. I know he was, it had to be because they were literary giants. He was, I'm sure, inspired by them. That he learned a lot of things from them. You take that interesting aspect of the end in your book there, where the castle crumbles and goes back into the ground. All that goes away, very much like the fall of the House of Usher with
Yeah.
Poe. So I can see some things that may have been influences on him, in that respect. But I think it was neat how he really liked, got in deep with some of the American writers.
You're again, you're right on the money. Bram came to America 8 times with the Lyceum Theater. They traveled all over the country each time. So somebody did a calculation of the 8 trips, and sometimes he was over here for 2 or 3 months, that Bram spent about 3 years in America on and off over about a 20-year period. And how many 50,000 miles he traveled or something on trains. I've seen some of the actual maps that Bram had collected, and he drew on them the train routes and the exact distance between each city. So he knew how long the trains would take. He knew what cities they were going to, obviously, for their engagements, but he had to arrange for trucks and everything to pick up all this stuff. He was.
I'm sure that's very important. If you've got a theater troupe, it's got to be somewhere at a certain time.
Yeah,
you're definitely going.
He's the manager. He's the guy. But during all this, he got to meet a lot of people, and Henry Irving was a big star in America, and Bram was in charge of all his engagements in the press, and a lot of people wanted to meet Irving. So Bram got sort of lucky that way. That's how he met some of these, highfalutin people like Buffalo Bill Cody. They became, the 3 of them, Stoker and Irving and Cody, good friends, and they both helped Buffalo Bill bring his Wild West show over to England and Scotland.
That's got to be where Quincy came from. No, that's got to be where Quincy came
absolutely. From. That's exact, and that's my point. He was very impressed with certain elements of America. Number one, the freedom that the country possessed, not just the wide openness and the ability for anyone to come over who's been persecuted religiously or whatever, but the literary freedom that Bram did not experience in Ireland or England. And so he became friends with Whitman, but also had some interesting discussions with him about censorship and some of the risque qualities of his books. And he said, look, if you just do a little censorship, you'd sell a lot of books. And Whitman said, absolutely not. I would not sell myself out just to sell some books. This is what I want to say. I don't care what people think, if there's sexual overtones or undertones in this story. So Bram was trying to, say, look, but you'll make more money. It's not all about money. And Bram really respected that about America. He wrote a whole a book that was a delivery, a speech to the London, what's it called? Institute, called The Glimpse of America, which painted a very, very positive image that America's going to be a force to reckon with. They got great spirit. They got great land. They got great cities. So you're absolutely right. I think there was a lot of influence.
Here's
he was. And one final thing, just quickly. Buffalo Bill Cody was not just Quincy Morris. He used him in 2 other stories. Elias Hutchison in The Squaw, and another frontiersman called Grizzly Dick in The Shoulder of Shasta out in California.
Oh, yeah. And, here's the interesting thing about Shasta. It has tons of supernatural stories about that mountain, by the way. I have a friend in the chat room right now who lives in California, and he knows what I'm talking about. But here's something else I just wanted to make a point on right quick. and it's very interesting. I love these historical tie-in things. He never met Poe, but he met Walt Whitman, and Walt Whitman knew Poe, and that had to come up in their talks, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Good point. Yeah.
Hmm. So I mean, it's sort of like that game they used to play, so and so many steps from so and so, and that was very close in steps to Poe and
Yeah.
some other interesting
6 degrees of separation, I think it's called, something like that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's it. And that is wild to think about it. And to me, it's so interesting to see what makes a writer tick, to see what's really going on in the mind and how he comes about and goes about gathering all this stuff to use. And to me, that is fascinating. It's a great study, especially when you can go back and study someone. And I'm sure you're invested in it because he's your relative. You definitely want to try to understand this man more and see where he's coming from and try to get a handle on what it is you are intrigued by him and the things that he does. I can see where you're coming from. Well, I want to ask you a quick personal question. Of all the movies and stuff that have been done of Dracula, what is your favorite Dracula movie? By the way, I was just wondering about that.
Well, there's really three that I always refer to because I get a little bit politically uh, delicate about this. Um, favorite is the 92 Francis Ford Coppola film, but with an asterisk because it's not faithful to the novel. That
No, it's
doesn't
not
make it an
good.
unfaithful, excuse me, uh, that I don't like it. Okay. I like the movie, but I realize it's written very different. There is that whole love interest that Dracula has with Mina Harker that does not exist in the novel. Okay, I like the movie though. Okay, it's got interesting characters. It's got costumes and all that. The most faithful to the novel is the 1977 Louis Jourdan BBC miniseries,
Oh yeah.
and Jourdan played Dracula, and it's quite faithful to the novel, but it's at 1977. It's very dark. It's very dated, obviously, not a whole lot of effects, but it's faithful to the novel. And then my next one I really did enjoy is the original 1931 Bela Lugosi, only because it was so groundbreaking. It was the first talking horror movie. It's got weird stuff like armadillos in the castle, in Transylvania, which don't exist in Transylvania. And Bela is just so wonderfully iconic with his speaking of English,
Some-
in a way
Somebody in
that
California just said, hey, let's throw some armadillos in here. It looks good.
somebody, yeah, just
That
some
was
weird creatures. But when Bela had to speak phonetically because he couldn't speak the language, that gave us some trope that we still have today, like "Welcome, enter freely, Mr. Harker," or Mr. Renfield, because actually they even changed in that story. It was Renfield who went to the castle. But those are my top three, and I will say, I don't know if any of your listeners have watched The Last Voyage of the Demeter. I think it's a darn good old-fashioned throwback scary movie, and it's part
I
of.
haven't seen that one. No.
Oh, you got to check it out, man. I mean, it's in chapter 7 in the novel, there was not a whole lot of the ship's log there, but the filmmakers used whatever was there. The names of the characters that Bram used as those sailors, didn't talk about all the crewmen. They used those names. They used certain elements, but obviously they had to make up a lot of stuff because there was such sparse information in chapter 7 about the voyage. But I thought it was great. A real badass Dracula, very claustrophobic, very dark, lots of jump scares. So those are my top 4. If any of you listeners are interested to sort of go check them out yourself.
Well, here's the thing, an interesting thing about this Dacre. Dracula has been romanticized to a certain extent. And in the original novel, he's kind of far from that to me. he is more parasitic in a way, in that kind of in a sickly kind of way. That's the way that Bram looked at him. He was, like you said, between two worlds. He was the undead. He wasn't normal. He wasn't like a regular human being. But we tend to, I don't know how this happened over the years, we tend to romanticize Dracula. And I think it was because of his control and power that he had. That's what it's all about. That's what the book is all about, his control and power over people, especially women. And, but it's not just women, it's people, it's men as well. But I'm saying I think we kind of wrote the romanticism into that more so than it was actually in the original in that respect. And you see that happening with a lot of these movies, like you said with Francis Ford Coppola. Great movie, but no, it was not. He changed it completely, okay, from what it should have been in the end, especially the way it ends, which kind of threw me off. I liked the movie, but it's not true to Dracula in that respect. And I agree with you about, the other movie, and of course, Bela Lugosi, who he always personifies for us Dracula. And here's, I think, the interesting thing about the Bela Lugosi thing is that it is taken from the play. Okay. And
Yes.
it's got that
Yes.
theatrical. Yeah, look, I think Brown would have liked that.
I'm so glad you said that. And I should step back a little bit in history. So 8 days before the novel came out, May 26, 1897, Bram Stoker created a staged reading for the novel Dracula in the Lyceum Theater. The script actually lives in the British Museum Library. I've seen it in person. I'm allowed to display a couple of pages of it. Bram cut and paste 2 copies of Dracula onto 145 pages or some odd pages with directions. One script only, and there was 11 people sitting on a stage and just passed between them over 8 hours and read the whole damn thing. Why? Just to secure the dramatic rights. It was open to the public, but they only cared they had to get at least 2 paying people in there to make it legitimate. When Bram did it, he then went over to Lord Chamberlain's office, claimed that he did it, signed the certificate. He got the dramatic rights to his book. He saved them, protected them. When he died in 1912, nobody had made a movie. Nobody had made a stage play of it. It was 10 years later that Nosferatu came up, and 12 years later that Florence Stoker had anything to do with exercising her rights that she was left by her husband to put this book onto stage. And Hamilton Dean, a fellow Irishman who was a friend of the Stokers, was the guy that she commissioned to do the first stage play. She got another guy, Charles Morel, do another one. That's another story. But when this play became a super hit, and Lugosi was a hit, and there was a couple other actors who played Dracula, but when an American, John Balderston, actually saw this and brought it over to the U.S., it was a big hit in America as well. But when it came time to sell those rights to Universal for the 1931 Bela Lugosi with Todd Browning directing, it was the staged play that Universal brought, just as you said. And Lugosi was not the first choice to play on film because he had acted in other films, but not Dracula before. But he was very well known and well thought of as a stage actor. But since the book was so hard to adapt into a 3-act play, Universal said, we're not going to go buy the book rights. That's too probably Mrs. Stoker would want a lot of money for it. But we're just going to buy the play rights since it's already been adapted and it's much easier for them to make their own script. So that's the short story on the dramatizing of the novel. And I think you're darn right, Dennis. Bram Stoker would have been very happy with this because it was, although they changed locations, because look, in a 3-act play, you can't have 150 different set changes like they do throughout the book, but it worked. And it was a big success on stage. And it was a bigger success when it hit film. And those 2 things stimulated book sales all over the world.
And it was interesting, too, that Lugosi had to petition to get the part. He actually, I think, had to take a cut in pay because he wanted so badly to
Yeah.
play that
Yeah.
part. That's
Yeah. He
interesting.
didn't make much money, but it defined him as an actor, didn't it? And he played Dracula once other in Frankenstein, and there's a appearance by Dracula in there, and he did play other vampires, but he didn't play Dracula more than twice
Yeah.
on two different films. But
I
as
think
they
he played
say,
him one other
you may have
time
heard
in
this
Abbott and
too.
Costello Meet Frankenstein. Remember that one? That's the one
Yeah,
he played
yeah,
Dracula in. But here's the thing. Here's the sad thing about it, Dacre. He was so brilliant, but it typecast him the rest of his life, and that's why he did these other parts. He did
yeah.
some of these other parts trying to get away from that typecasting, but he never could.
No, you're right, which is sad. And he was actually one of the first actors to sort of publicly talk about his addiction to alcohol, because he had a hard time kicking that as well. And I think because there was some depression and so on from being typecasted and not being able to move on to other
And
characters.
the interesting thing that they had him buried in his Dracula cape. That's the interesting thing. Sort of like he sort of, you know, resigned to it there in the end. That's just the way it's going, and that's the way it went. That's very interesting. But yeah,
Yeah, I
he had a
actually,
little problem, I think, that way. And he actually came out as one of the first people. They used to call it going to an asylum then, but nowadays we call it rehab.
yeah,
But he
sure.
he admitted to that. Yeah, that's fascinating. He was a
I was
great
able to
actor,
visit
but
his
I think
gravesite.
I think
Um,
the number one thing that did it with Dracula for him was that accent. You know,
yeah,
that's the way we think Dracula talks. You know.
we do, and we all joke about it. I want to drink blood. It's like,
Hmm.
first of all, Emily Gerard, Scottish writer, helped Bram with her description of real myths of vampirism in Transylvania. And so that was the first step of kind of creating the story. Bram was originally going to set the story in Austria after Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, fellow Irishman, wrote Carmilla, the story of a female vampire. Bram looked at the book Land Beyond the Forest by Emily Gerard and an essay she wrote called Transylvanian Superstitions. He shifted gears, goes to Transylvania, and that sort
Hmm.
of created the whole thing about Transylvania. It's like running wild with vampires. Well, then Bela, who's from neighboring Hungary, he comes over and speaks in this tone. And now that's confirming to everybody in the world that you go to visit Transylvania and you're going to meet everybody speaking this way and seeing vampires around every corner. Well, let me tell you, it's the farthest from the truth. I lead tours over there with a tour company called experience-transylvania.com. And it's a lovely country. Although you go to the countryside, they have interesting rituals. They have interesting beliefs. They've got a lot of melting pots of different religions and superstition. And they've got very interesting, long, drawn out mourning rituals to make sure that the body or the spirits of those dead don't come back as vampire or strigoi or restless spirits. So it comes by it honestly, but it's not like you get off the plane and everyone's running around in a cloak and an accent like Bela.
Well, the interesting thing about that, I'm gonna tell you a little story right quick. Okay, I found this in Irish folklore. Okay, and the story goes, I can't remember the names. I will have to get it down for you. But anyway, this certain lord who was a lord over, back in the day, back in feudal times, the lord was sort of the big boss man around the neighborhood there. He had the castle and the villages belonged to him and all that. So he was a very powerful man, very controlling man. And this guy was very evil. Okay. And I mean, people just hated this guy's guts. I mean, he was very bad dude. So when he died, it was no surprise to these people that he came back as a vampire. Now, according to folklore, that's one of the ways you come back as a vampire. Is you die as being a very evil and malevolent person. you usually come back. Okay, because you're evil, as Shakespeare said, evil doesn't die with us. In our graves, it lives on. And this is what happened with that story. But anyway, the interesting thing is that he started terrorizing the neighborhood. Going around sucking people's blood, doing the things your typical vampire does. Now, this is Irish folklore now. And this sounds so much like Dracula to a certain extent to me. Because you got this nobleman, and he's coming back, and he's feeding off of his people. And so a vampire hunter comes along. And they've tried several things to keep this guy in his grave. They drove a stake in him. They put a brick in his mouth, and the regular things they used to do with vampires to keep him from coming back. But he still kept coming back. So the vampire hunter says, "Oh, no, 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 you're doing this all wrong. You got to bury him upside down, head first in the ground. And that way he can't come back." And that solved their problem. But when I heard that, I said, "Yeah, that has echoes of Dracula like to that to me." And I just have to wonder if Bram might have heard that from his mother or grandmother. It's interesting.
I'm aware that I believe that's the vampire myth all about Abertac. So you guys can go and Google Abertac. I can't spell it, but it's like ABARCATCH, something like that. So there's a number of these life-sucking creatures, cautionary tales to control populations. Dare Do is another one that J.D. Barker and I used in our novel Dracula, a prequel to Dracula, something that Bram would have heard as a kid, because all kids are told these stories. Everybody grows up learning these stories of restless spirits, malevolent spirits. And you better watch out if you're evil, or you don't do your chores, or if you go have an affair with somebody, or have a kid out of wedlock, there'll be a vampire. So there's all this cautionary stuff to sort of keep people living a good life. And I think, Dennis, that Bram was very well aware of those. I'll tell you what also would help to make aware of that is that I found all the books that he used for his research. And some of them were in his own personal library that got sold after he died. And I've seen the list of all these books. I've gone and purchased copies of them that look like they would have superstition and folklore in them. One of them is Ancient Legends of Ireland by Lady Jane Wilde. And it's got a page in it that says Irish folklore is very similar to that of Transylvania. It contains stories of werewolves and vampires, and Madame Gerard has given a recent account of it. That's Emily Gerard, who I talked about. And it goes on to more detail about some of these Irish folklore being very similar to Transylvania. So I think Bram was aware. He didn't need to write this thing down in his notes because he already had it in his brain. The notes that he took were things that were in the London Library that had actually accounts of vampirism, superstition, and folklore all over Europe, particularly in Transylvania. Those are the things he was not aware of, and he wrote those things in his notes. And those things transferred right into the novel. The things like how to kill the vampire, staking wooden stakes, cutting the head off totally, putting the garlic in, the holy wafers, the water, holy water, all that stuff is what comes out of these different books, serious resource books that he found in the London Library.
And he had such a whale to draw from, because vampires and werewolves are found throughout the world in every culture almost. I mean, look, you have the Greek vampire, the Vavalaka, which is very much like the Stringor, and some of these others that you hear about, the Vertilac, and all the rest of these vampire type things. You've got such a rich tapestry to draw from on that. So I can see where he was coming at. He had a really good playground on that. Well, this has been fascinating. Definitely, absolutely. It's always enjoyable when I get to talk with you. You bring him to life for us in that respect, and I know without a doubt he is somewhere wherever he's at, very grateful to have a relative like you to carry on his legacy. And the legacy of Dracula lives on. And I think that's fascinating, and it's because of your efforts that a lot of that is happening. So you should be definitely congratulated for your dedication to this. And we're gonna take a few questions from everybody now,
Sure, let's do it.
and see what we got going on, and we'll talk about some of your.
I think I lost the audio to Dennis. Not sure if he has gone from the podcast or if he's just put me in front while he's trying to listen to the chat. And unfortunately, folks, I do not see the questions in the chat. So I'll just keep telling you a couple things until this thing gets back on its feet. I do lead these tours off to places, interesting places like Transylvania. I'll be doing another one this coming June, actually June 7th till the 14th. If you want more information on that, go check out experience-transylvania.com. The owner of the company she's now married to a Swede, but she's from Transylvania, and her sister, Nora, both speak perfect English. And we normally do these tours with about 10 to 12 people max. I like smaller tours like this, and we travel in a 14-passenger van to see all the cool castles and the birthplace of Vlad the Impaler. And what we like to do is compare and contrast both Vlad, Dracula, and Count Dracula as well. Sorry, we lost you for a second there, Dennis, but I'm glad you're back. I was just telling people about the tours that I run to locations associated with both Vlad and the Count in Transylvania and Whitby, England, and Cruden Bay, Scotland, where Bram wrote the novel. But yeah, have you got some questions lined up from some of the listeners?
Yeah, let's see what we got. Got some questions out there for us. Want to hear questions and not crickets, okay? What we got? Let's see. Yeah, if you have any questions, please put them in caps. Okay. Question on the tours you have led. Has there been any supernatural encounters?
I wish I could say there were. The only somewhat strange encounters I've had, none with the groups of the tourists, although one guy was a paranormal investigator. He brought one of his little spirit box with him. And when we were at the grave site, supposed grave site of Vlad the Impaler, he picked up some weird chatter. That's one thing. But I had a weird experience myself when I was leading a group and went to Ireland and was in Marsh's library. I was there to do a presentation, Stoker on Stoker, the life of Bram Stoker, his research and writing, and never happened before in my life. My computer just went dead. The battery it was full like half an hour before. So anyway, okay, here we go. How do you feel about Dracula being made part of some monsterverse? Well, yeah, he's a monster, and Bram, he painted him as a monster because he was supposed to be scary as all get out, and it's kind of cool that when you look at the most iconic monsters nowadays, classic monsters, it's Dracula, it's Frankenstein, and then we go into the Swamp Thing, we go into Mothman and other cool things that may or may not have existed. But it's neat to see him as a classic. And I think it's kind of cool that 127 years later, people are still, wondering and talking like we are tonight. Where did he come from? How was the writer motivated? What was inside in thoughts? Was he trying to make it real, or did he know it was all fantasy?
That's interesting, and especially with the universal monsters, they're taken in a group all the time. Of course, Dracula is one of them, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and the Creature from the Black Lagoon. I grew up as a kid watching those. Okay, that was a normal affair on Saturday afternoon on TV to watch. But they're lumped together You know,
They they are.
it's universal. Yeah.
Hey, Dennis, let's do this to your listeners to stimulate some answers and questions. I was raised, when I was a kid, Dark Shadows, the Munsters, the Addams Family. So those are my, some obviously comedy. Dark Shadows is pretty heavy stuff. For all of you listeners out there, what was your, what did you cut your teeth on in the vampire or horror world? Anybody have some interesting stories, or what was your first vampire movie? Mine was Fearless Vampire Killers. I was at boarding school, and on Friday nights they had movies, and of course September, October, scary movies. And when this one came on, I thought it was very cool. And of course, when it's like at the end of it, it says based on or inspired by Bram Stoker's Dracula. Everybody's like, pointing at me, Stoker, it's your family, this sort of thing. So it's kind of funny. But I'd love to hear what you guys started off your love of vampires or monsters with.
Somebody mentioned Monster Squad. I remember that one. Yeah, that was. What do you think about that new Nosferatu that's supposed to be out? I think in December.
Well, I read a very thorough review just yesterday, Dennis, and I've seen a couple of trailers. I am crossing my fingers that it is everything that it is being chalked up to be, a very terrifying, not romanticized, terrifying, horrifying, jump scares and everything like it should be. And that's what I'm led to believe by reading this initial review from some of the screenings. So I'm hoping it's going to be that, because I am trying, as you know, to bring back the Man in Black, Bram Stoker's original Dracula, not the happy-go-lucky, fun, sexy-looking guy that could be a runway model or something like that. I want the real guy back again, like
Well, there's
Bram
that.
Stoker.
Hopefully, that tie-in. We've talked about that before with the plague kind of a thing.
Yes,
The
yeah,
original
agreed.
Nosferatu had that. That's one of my favorites. I watch it from time to time. It's great, even though it has no dialogue. It is still a great movie. I hope they keep that element in it, because that was a very interesting tie-in with the plague kind of a thing.
And it was real. You see, that's the thing, is the plague in Germany brought on by rats was a real thing. So it's
And there's
that
a
was
lot of rat icon.
Yes. And he looked like Orlok, looked like a rat, looked like a human version of the rat. And Murnau capitalized on that by, again, like Bram did to his story, making it feel real, that maybe this is, that rat thing that's now taking people out. Is it the plague? Is it the guy from the grave? What is it? Makes people believe. Again, it could be real.
And here's the interesting thing: some of the movies that we love, like The Lost Boys, the Fearless Vampire Killers, all these movies that have come out over the years, all have to pay homage to Dracula. That's the original start on a lot of this stuff, especially for Hollywood. Absolutely, that's the way that goes. And I think, like I said earlier, his legacy still is living on, and he would have to be very pleased with that. I would be, as a writer. Any writer would be pleased to know that you've had such an impact on not just your field, but so many different fields,
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously gone way beyond just Dracula. You look at the whole concept of the vampire, how they became more humanized, with Stephen King's vampires, Stephanie Meyer's vampires, Anne Rice's vampires, Charlene Harris, and obviously when we move beyond literature and we get into comic books, we get into games, we get into film, we get into animated film, Sesame Street. I mean, it's like these are like pervaded into our whole life. It's not just the Dracula trope that Bram's created. They have now become worldwide and at every different level of and on top of that, maybe as we're getting winding down, think of this. Halloween is defined by our monsters, and Dracula is one of the biggies. But you know what the second most popular date of the year for Dracula is, or any vampire? It's Valentine's Day. And that's a
Well, of course.
product of what you said at the beginning of the show, Dennis. Love is forever. The stuff that, the power, the strong guy, the man that wants to be strong to wow woman. It goes back to those females in the Lugosi movie and the Christopher Lee, all of them, all the 7 movies he played Dracula in, with the sheer negligees and the sexuality, the sort of the blood exchange.
They sexualized it. They sexualized Dracula
Absolutely.
because
Yeah.
it makes money. Yeah.
That's what it's
Well,
all
they got-
about, is get bums in the seats in the theater. And so they're still doing it by saying, hey, there's a love element. Love is forever, like the 92 Coppola film. And let's pay homage to that during Valentine's Day with opera, with theater. So all the people in my world, it's like we're not done in September and October. It's back again in February, when it's time for a little more Valentine's action.
That's a fascinating thing. Like I said, when you go back to the original Dracula, there's no romance with Dracula himself. You've got romance going on, but it's not Dracula himself. And we put it on Dracula. I think a lot of that because, like I said, they sexualize him, but it goes into the sexuality a lot because of the control and power.
Yeah,
That's
right.
where that's coming from. But another interesting aspect of it, Dacre, is that that rat that we talked about earlier. It's not the bats as much as it is the rats. They put in a bigger appearance than people would think. Although rats are, if you go back into Romanian folklore and stuff, they are attributed to or closely tied to vampires and stuff like that. It's
Creatures of the night, absolutely. Bats, rats, owls, even wolves. It's nocturnal life
creatures of the night. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, when you can't see it and you can't really identify it, and you don't have like a tons of street lights in modern day, it's like, get inside the house. These nighttime creatures, they're bad. They're hanging around, graveyards, dumps. They're disease. They're bringing this bad stuff to you. So it's lack of understanding, and better just to be inside your house and lock yourself in and have a nice big fire, so you're safe, where the light can save you from these creatures of the night.
well, and that goes back deep into folklore and superstition. And here's another aspect. I'm rereading Salem's Lot, and I like the original Salem's Lot. I don't like the remakes. The original with David Soul was great, but if you go back and read Stephen King, it is really a homage to Dracula in many ways, because he quotes Dracula some, he mentions Dracula a lot. It is sort of his homage in a way to Dracula, and that's interesting if you look at it that way. But to me, the interesting thing about Salem's Lot, it's not just one person; it's a whole town that falls victim to that, and it goes back to very much like Nosferatu with the plague kind of thing. The vampire represents the plague, definitely.
Sure is.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think Stephen King even said that he imagined if Bram Stoker was to have Count Dracula come to America, much like he had him come to Whitby, and then he took the train or flew to London. If he was coming to America, he would be coming to a small town like Salem's Lot. Obviously, King grew up in Maine himself, in small towns, and that's what I like about his writing. They're very realistic. But he said, I envisioned him coming to Bram, bring him to a small town where he would then slowly take over everybody, and nobody would know if they're safe or not. I love that book. That was one of the first vampire stories that I read, Dennis, back when I was in college.
And he does that. Dracula does that to Whitby and the Bay and all that. He really has an effect on him. Maybe not as much as great as Salem's Lot does, but it does have an effect on it. And you've got the wolf element too. I think that's a very interesting tie-in Dacre, that you've got such a thin line between werewolves and vampires, especially in superstition. They're both creatures, they're supernatural creatures, but you've got a real tie into them. You have the wolf spirit and the vampire spirit type thing going on. That's fascinating when you think about it.
Well, Bram obviously wrote one of the first vampire novels, but it was the first one where he did tie it in to the wolf and the werewolf. One of the sources that he used, that he was quoted in the one interview he gave, was Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould, who wrote the book on werewolves. And the deleted second chapter that you have in your book, Dracula's Guest, I highly recommend all you listeners. You want to look at it for free? Go to bramstoker.org and read Dracula's Guest. It starts a lot like Sabine Baring-Gould's book on werewolves, and I'm not going to spoil it for you. It's just a very short story. It was the original chapter 2 in Dracula, but
I was going to bring that up. Dracula's Guest is definitely a tie into werewolves. The way you look at them and the way it's written, definitely.
And when Dracula lands in Whitby on the ship, the Demeter, he jumps off as a big black dog, not a bat. He could fly off, but he jumped. And why is that? It's very close to the wolf, and there happens to be local folklore in Whitby about the big black dog called the Bagasht, that is the omen of death. So Bram would morph things believable to the local fiction.
Well, you have an interesting thing about that. In Europe and places, you have what's called a church grim. And the church grim is usually a black dog, a sort of a spectral hound that haunts churchyards and stuff. And it goes back in legend to the fact that they would actually kill a dog and bury it, I think in the north corner of at the north corner of the church. And it was the guardian of the churchyard. And that's where you get church grims at. I mean, I'll just say this about Bram Stoker. He knew his superstitions. He knew his legends. He definitely knew his supernatural folklore, without doubt.
He did his research. He knew it consciously and unconsciously, and he studied it, and he made sure he had it right. Then he wove it into the story along with fact to make it sound and feel very much like fiction.
Well, I know you travel a lot and you do a lot of promotions, and we got a question here. It says, does the phenomenon of Bram Stoker have a part in your everyday life?
That's a great question. I would honestly say probably at least once a day something crosses over my bow that has to do with Bram, where somebody asked me about it. Obviously, I've been at it for 12 years. I spend a lot of time at my desk, either, writing stories, writing introductions to other people's stories, fine-tuning my presentations, dealing with, I work in something called the Stoker Verse, which is a company that me and Chris McCauley has made. We're creating games, card games, video games, board games. I now am a part owner of a vineyard called Stoker Wines in Romania, real Romanian vineyard. So I have to say now, in the past 2 years, there's definitely something Bram Stoker almost every day that I'm dealing with.
Well, you're gonna have to put on one of those bottles. I don't drink wine, but I drink this one.
Yeah, we're actually thinking that as a tag line, Dennis. I don't drink vine, V-I-N-E, but
I drink this one.
But I drink, but we make an exception on our wine or something like that. We're working on it.
There you go. I'll make an exception with this.
Yeah.
I know you had an appearance coming up this weekend at the Apothecary in New Orleans. Is that right?
I'm heading to one of my favorite places in this country that's got really cool.
It is a very
cultish vampire vibes.
City.
It is. They've got all kinds of cool, voodoo, magic, vampires in New Orleans. And a good friend of mine, Marita Crandall, owns the Boutique de Vampire, the Apothecary, Vampire Cafe, and Potions. So I'm giving talks all about Bram's life at the Apothecary restaurant. They've got a cool room upstairs, the big screen. So yeah, I'm doing all that. I'm looking forward to it, and going to see some people there
She had a
that
very
I
cool
that I
story
see
about
every year.
actually meeting or what she thought may have been an actual vampire that paid a visit to her shop one time. She wrote a very interesting book on the vampires of New Orleans. Fascinating.
Yeah.
I have a copy of it somewhere here. I loved it, and that is a very a lot of the southern cities like Charleston, and I've done a lot of interesting research in Charleston. I've done a lot of investigations, a lot of cases that have come up there. Actually, I investigated the Hotel Aiken. I don't know if I ever told you that.
I
I
did not know
actually,
that.
yeah, did an investigation in that hotel, which was kind of hard to do because I think it had like 3 bars going at one time. So it was kind of noisy. But we did a paranormal investigation there, and one night or over a weekend actually. It was fascinating, and but you got a lot of these cities like that, especially in the South. Well, not just the South. You got cities like Long Beach,
Savannah, Georgia. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe you'll do a world tour on that one day and bring in all the cities that are
Yep.
haunted cities. That would be
That's once we get all of our FDA licenses and trademarks for Stoker wines, then I'll start traveling more in the U.S. to do launching events. But yeah, I mean, after that, I got a gig out in Oakland and San Jose at the Winchester House, Cameron Stanford House, just before Christmas. Yeah, so that's a cool place with lots of interesting history for the
Well,
paranormal and horror
the
folks.
John Wayne brand has been very successful with the whiskeys. They've done done a lot with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I saw that the other day. I think it was mentioned that, and I thought about your wines. When you brand something like that, if you especially go national with it, you got a much better shot at it. Actually, turning a much better profit for you. The bigger your field, the better. Huh? That's the way it goes.
That's it. So Dennis, let's wrap this up with either one more question from you or any of your audience. Does anybody pop back in with any of the movies that they've liked, or which ones? Because I want to ask you, what movies are your favorite? If you had a top 3 Dracula films,
Pretty much
you
falling in
talked
line
a
with
couple,
yours.
but you put me on the spot for 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, what do you like?
Christopher Lee was excellent as Dracula in many aspects, but it got kind of after the first 2 or 3 Dracula movies, it kind of started lacking a lot on that. But I will always love Bela Lugosi. That was, to me, that's Dracula. Francis Ford Coppola was very good, but he kind of dropped the ball on that in my book. I kind of he was doing very good, and then he dropped the ball on it. And that one, of course, that you mentioned with Louis Jordan, that's a good one. And I have more than 3. I have a bunch of that
No,
I
I'm
like.
sure, and that's what makes it hard to. So let me hit you with one more. Clay's Bang, in the BBC Netflix co-production 3-part series written by Mark Gatiss and Steve Moffat. Did you see that one?
Yeah, I have seen that. Yeah, that was a very good, and that was very close to the book in many aspects. Yeah, but it's kind of rare.
At,
It's kind of hard to find that one.
at least the first 2 segments were close, but the third segment was way strange. I respected it. Not my favorite, but I respected what they did because I thought that was interesting.
And Jack Palance actually did a very good Dracula too. Yeah, that was that was very,
he
was
was
Dan Curtis.
If I understand right, he was the first one that made the connection with Vlad the Impaler as a Dracula.
Oh yeah,
the first film. Obviously Coppola did a real serious connection, and the first 3 minutes of the movie was like, this is Vlad the Impaler's conversion. But Jack Palance, I believe, was the first one that Curtis's film. And then, of course, in 2014, I believe, it was Dracula Untold with Luke Evans. There's a whole movie on the conversion of Vlad the Impaler and why he had to drink the blood and convert into a vampire to protect his people. But yeah, any final question, Dennis, before I check off? Because I'm beginning to fade a little bit like a vampire when the light comes up, but my light's
That's
going
fine.
down
Yeah,
on
I'm
you a little
looking
bit.
to
So,
say, I
any
think
more
that's
questions tonight?
I think that's covering all of our questions right now. I really do appreciate you being here and you spending this time with us. And like I say, you're part of the Hunting the Shadows family now. We will help put your stuff out there. And you feel free to post on my Facebook pages anything you want anytime.
Well,
And
listen,
I have about
yeah, thank
6,000 followers. So,
Oh, that's
uh,
awesome. I appreciate that. Let's do this. Maybe 4 or 5 months when I got some more interesting adventures under my belt. Let's have another check in, and I'd also love to hear. I like constructive criticism on books that I've written. So I'd love to hear what you think about the annotated Dracula with Robert. And I want to end with this, playing a little homage to Robert. Robert 18 Pasang, who I spent 2 years working on this book that Dennis is talking about, the 125th anniversary edition, annotated edition, over 1,100 footnotes, all the bits and pieces that were taken out of the typescript that Paul Allen owns. And Robert was there every step of the way, leading the charge. Robert was one. He passed away about 3 months after we finished writing the book together. Robert had had MS and he suffered a heart attack, and his wife brought him to the hospital in Vancouver, Canada, to get checked out. And they said, "Well, it's been a minor heart attack. You got to wait a couple of days. We're going to do a stint." And they had him on blood thinners and so on. And I talked to him almost every day. He's in the hospital for 4 or 5 days. And he had good spirits. But Matilda contacted me the day after I had the last chat with him, sort of around noontime, that said that last night he had to go to the bathroom, and he was all wired up with all the IVs and all this stuff, and he was
mhm.
impatient and didn't want to wait for the nurse to come to do the bedpan thing. So he tried to get up, and because he was a little unstable with the MS, he fell and banged his head on the sink in his
Oh,
room. And because he was on all these thinners, he had an internal brain bleed,
oh,
and he had the brain swelling, went unconscious, and never regained consciousness. And Matilda sat with him, read to him, and he passed within 7 or 8 hours. And she said, Robert was I mean, he had the largest collection of vampire books and comics, periodicals in the world. And he was so into this. He said there was really it was the only way to go. She said it was a Renfield syndrome. In the novel, unlike any of the films, Renfield has a brain bleed because Dracula beats him up in his room in the asylum. And he also has a brain bleed. And Bram Stoker had his brother,
oh,
Thornley Stoker, describe how to do brain trephination surgery. And they were able to reduce the
very
pressure.
ironic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is ironic, but that's my co-author, and this guy deserves all the accolades for really leading the charge on this book. Both of us had actually visited the Dracula typescript and been able to, give what we remembered to this book. So that's how on a positive note, Robert is probably looking up down at us and saying, "Thank you, Dacre. Keep my legacy alive as well."
That's good. That's good, and of course, you know who my favorite, my hero is in Dracula. That is Abraham Van Helsing. Okay, if it hadn't been for him, that would have been it. So I'm gonna close with my favorite quote from Dracula. Okay, and that's this. Okay, I want you to believe in things that you cannot. And
Oh, I
that
love
sums
that
up
one.
Dracula for me. Okay. Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you being here tonight. I will turn you loose now, and we'll have to get together again in the future, in a few months maybe, and check in again with you, and see how you're doing and how everything's going with you. And we really do appreciate you being here tonight, and we really thank you for your dedication and your perseverance in this. It is admirable, very admirable. And thank you so much for keeping this legacy alive for all of us.
Well, Dennis, thank you. Keep hunting the shadows, as your title says. Good for you. Thank you very much for your support and encouragement. Have a great night, everybody. Bye bye now.
Take care. That's a great gentleman right there, Mr. Dacre Stoker. I absolutely always enjoy interviewing him, and appreciate you all being here tonight, your questions, your support, and friend request for Duke Sullivan, World Bigfoot Central. He's sick. Oh, okay. We will definitely put him on the prayer list. Absolutely. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I hope you enjoyed that with Mr. Stoker. He's keeping his great man uncle's dream alive, and that is interesting very much. And we can really appreciate him for doing that. Prayers for everyone, positive healing energy. Yes, sir. Thank you, Russell. Good to have you here, bud. Thank you, Ann, and I want to thank you. Violin makes me cry. Overbuilt automotive. And if I'm missing anybody, I'm sorry. Okay, but hello, Philip. Good to have you here. Sovereign Cosmic Wild Man and Woo Rider and Shiro and my good brother Midwest Night Watchers and Ace Banner. I like that name, 007. All right. And I appreciate you all being here, and I appreciate your support. The Patreon is growing, and if you decide you would like to join and participate in helping with more shows like this in the future, please feel free to do so. This is the address for the Patreon right here. And if you would like to join that and become an official shadow hunter, we're going to be hunting some more shadows in the future. We got some very interesting things lined up. I've got Brian from Strange Montauk. He's going to be on here. And we're getting some other people lined up. And so you definitely, I'm trying to set up a special that may be this Saturday or Sunday. I will let you know exactly when it's going to be. With the Duchess, Danielle Neva Borzon. She is supposed to be a direct descendant of Dracula. So I want to talk with her about that. And she has some other things going on too. She's into holistic healing and stuff like that. So we're definitely going to get her on here and all that. And there we go. Join the Shadows Patreon. There it is. Check it out. And like I said, please support some of these people that we've been talking about. Barb Hartman, go check her channel out. Give it some love. Subscribe, and ring her bell. And check her out. Check out, of course, my good friend Jessica Jones. She had a great show on werewolves today. Go check that out. And shop at her War Woman Goods Etsy shop. Check out my good brother and friend Gerald Fountain at Midwest Night Watchers. He has a shop. Let me see if I've got the link for that. I don't think I've got the link for that on here. But he has a shop, and you might want to go check it out. Please do so. I'm checking to see if I've got a link for that there. Let's see. There's Barb Hartman's channel. Go give it some love, okay? And tell them Dennis sent you. Check her out. She's wanting to get some more subscribers and all that. So please show her. And here's Jessica's Etsy shop. Check it out. Here's Midwest Night Watchers merchandise shop. Go check it out. Look at all the good places you got to shop for my Christmas presents, okay? Don't pass up this opportunity now, all right? But I want to thank you all definitely for being here tonight. This has been a fantastic night and very enjoyable. And I appreciate you all being here and your support. I want to wish you all a good night. And remember what I always say. Non tembo mala, fear no evil. Okay. God bless you all and Godspeed. The hunt has begun. Hunting the shadows.